Estamos lejos, pero seguimos unidos. La distancia no es impedimento para que sigamos trabajando en equipo. Las circunstancias cambiaron, pero no significa que nuestra labor se detuvo. Al contrario, nuestro esfuerzo ahora debe ser mayor. Es importante para nosotros que continúes trabajando desde tu casa. Cuídate, protege a los tuyos y sigue las indicaciones frente al COVID-19 que la universidad ha compartido para ti. Disfruta de tu familia, organiza tu espacio laboral y gracias por seguir construyendo con nosotros desde tu hogar.
doctor Anaclet Pons, que hace parte de los eventos que hemos venido desarrollando durante el segundo semestre de 2020 en el marco de la celebración de los 10 años de vida académica de la revista como proyecto académico, en que han participado mancomunadamente el comité editorial, el comité científico, los coordinadores editoriales, los coordinadores editoriales invitados, los evaluadores, la administración de la universidad encabeza a sus vicerrectores, el vicerrector, el doctor Enrique, del rector y de las demás entes administrativos, decanos, coordinadores académicos, en fin. También de los directores del doctorado en historia y de los colegas del área de historia, quienes paulatinamente nos han venido apoyando en este trance. Un agradecimiento también especial a nuestros invitados, a los evaluadores, quienes paulatinamente pues, nos han aportado un granito de arena para este proceso. Como parte pues, del equipo editorial, es importante reconocer el trabajo de los asistentes editoriales, quienes de una u otra manera han venido alimentando este ejercicio académico investigativo y sin su apoyo, pues estas actividades serían totalmente imposibles. Estos esfuerzos han sido importantes de la revista y para generar toda una comunidad académica que es nuestro espíritu y nuestro proyecto. De igual manera, nuestro reconocimiento a los asesores, traductores que han vislumbrado aspectos técnicos, procesos a seguir. Saludamos igualmente a todas aquellas personas que de una u otra manera han apoyado los procesos administrativos de gestión, visibilización de la revista, al público en general, que han seguido los eventos a través de las plataformas virtuales y con la lectura y comentarios de los artículos han permitido conocer las actividades periódicas que hemos desarrollado. Entonces, de esta manera queremos compartir con ustedes hoy un tema que nos han participado, que nos han compartido los doctores Jeffrey Barash, el doctor Ethan Kleinberg y el doctor Ian Milligan. Entonces, para ellos, good morning, thank you for accepting the invitation, a publication in History and Memory. Nuestro agradecimiento y nuestro reconocimiento, en primer lugar, por haber participado en el proyecto de publicación y, en segundo lugar, por acompañarnos hoy en este conversatorio. Es nuestra primera experiencia en hacer un conversatorio en inglés y, digamos, queremos con esto incursionar en otro público también de habla inglesa y que nos puedan apoyar y que puedan consultar historia y memoria. Entonces, muchas gracias. A continuación, el doctor Rafael Buitrago, quien es el coordinador de la Escuela de Posgrado de la Universidad Pedagógica y Tecnológica de Colombia, de la Facultad de Educación, y este panel estará coordinado por la doctora Catherine Mora, quien es nuestra coordinadora académica de los programas de maestría y doctorado. Doctor Rafael, tiene usted la palabra.
Muy buenos días para todos y para todas. Escribimos para pensar, para sentir, para soñar, para hablar, para vivir, para compartir, para ser felices, para crear, para transmitir, para expresarnos, para confundir, para bailar, para seducir, para dibujar y ante todo, para hacer catarsis. Un saludo cordial para la doctora Olga Acuña, amiga entrañable, colega, editora de la revista Historia y Memoria, a la doctora Catherine Mora Pacheco, coordinadora académica del área de historia, a todos los integrantes de los comités científico y editorial, a los asistentes que han hecho parte de la revista, a los evaluadores y autores que se han vinculado a lo largo de estos 10 años, a los invitados especiales con los que tendremos el privilegio de compartir el día de hoy, y a todas y todos los participantes de este festejo. Cuando pensamos en revistas científicas, nos vemos abocados a algunos dilemas, ¿no? ¿Quiénes deben y pueden publicar? ¿Qué evaluadores seleccionar y cómo motivar su participación? ¿En qué bases indexarse? ¿Cómo incrementar el índice H, el factor de impacto? Y toda esta gestión editorial que implica un esfuerzo importante y una inversión muy grande de tiempo, no se ve recompensada por lo general por las políticas, apoyos y apuestas institucionales, nacionales y gubernamentales que por lo general terminan siendo insuficientes. Y además de ello, nos enfrentan en muchas ocasiones a monopolios editoriales, estructuras perversas y lógicas económicas, políticas y de poder que no siempre se articulan a la calidad y pertinencia social y académica. E incluso, en muchas ocasiones, Se desdibuja la importancia de las revistas. Ayer en la tarde escuchábamos al doctor Rafael Repiso, quien hacía énfasis en este aspecto en particular, la importancia de las revistas, lógicamente, para los investigadores, para las disciplinas y áreas, y ante todo para las universidades. Este es el panorama en el que viven, crecen y se potencian nuestras revistas. Por eso, al conmemorar estos 10 años de Historia y Memoria, nos sentimos profundamente felices y orgullosos, porque esta revista ha logrado mantener e incrementar su calidad, la esencia y la apuesta académica e investigativa que se propuso desde su nacimiento y que a lo largo de los años se ha ido consolidando hasta llegar a establecerse como un referente imprescindible para muchos docentes e investigadores en la Facultad de Ciencias de la Educación, en la Universidad Pedagógica y Tecnológica de Colombia, en el país, en Latinoamérica y desde luego en el contexto global. Podemos señalar, por lo tanto, que hemos logrado mucho, que hemos aportado en diferentes niveles y contextos, pero que el compromiso hacia adelante se complejiza y los desafíos se incrementan, más allá de los rankings y las mediciones, para mantener de alguna manera la investigación como una alternativa fundamental para tomar decisiones, transformar contextos y, ante todo, mejorar el bienestar de las personas y las comunidades. Por lo tanto, tengo la certeza de que Historia y Memoria seguirá siendo un lugar de privilegio para pensar, sentir, aportar y debatir desde la pluralidad de las voces que presentan sus hallazgos, sus críticas y reflexiones a partir de una perspectiva histórica que es fundamental y que nos permite configurar desde diversos lugares y espacios la memoria propia, colectiva, social, cultural y educativa. Concluyo explicitando mi gran alegría por tener el privilegio de compartir esta celebración de conmemoración de nuestra revista Historia y Memoria, agradeciendo y felicitando a los editores, asistentes y equipos editoriales que han logrado con su trabajo, tesón y empeño recorrer este sendero y consolidar una revista de estas características, calidad y relevancia. Así que además de darles la bienvenida, festejar este momento especial y reconocer los logros obtenidos, los invito a disfrutar del panel que hemos preparado en el marco de estos 10 años de Historia y Memoria. Muchas gracias, un fuerte abrazo y nos seguiremos encontrando entre textos, ideas y emociones.
Muchas gracias, doctor Rafael. Buenos días para todas las personas que nos acompañan, bienvenidos. Para este conversatorio primero voy a presentar a los panelistas, cada uno de los cuales tendrá 20 minutos para su intervención. Al finalizar las presentaciones formularé algunas preguntas a ellos. El panel se desarrollará completamente en inglés, tanto las conferencias como la sección de preguntas. Y a quienes quieran profundizar en el contenido de las presentaciones, los invito a leer el número especial conmemorativo de la revista Historia y Memoria y también pues a repetir esta presentación que quedará grabada en este mismo canal. Okay. Welcome everybody. I'm going to introduce the panelists. Each speaker will have 20 minutes for his presentation. At the end of this session, I will ask some questions to our guests. The authors are Jeffrey Andrew Barash, PhD in European Intellectual History from the University of Chicago. He is an emeritus professor of philosophy at l'Université d'Amiens, France. He is the author and editor of many books, including Martin Heidegger and the Problem of Historical Meaning, Collective Memory and the Historical Past, and The Symbolic Construction of Reality, The Legacy of Ernst Casimir. Ethan Kleinberg, PhD in History from UCLA, is a professor of History and Letters at Wesleyan University and editor-in-chief of History and Theory. He was the director of Wesleyan University Center for the Humanities. Kleinberg is the author of Hunting History for a Deconstructive Approach to the Past and Generation Existential, Heidegger's Philosophy in France, 1927 to 61. He is the co-editor, along with Ranjan Ghosh, of the volume on Presence, and author of numerous articles on intellectual history and the theory of history. And Ian Milligan, PhD in Canadian history from York University. He is a professor of history at the University of Waterloo. His primary research focuses on how historians can use web archives as well as the impact of digital sources on historical practice more generally. He's the author of History in the Age of Abundance and Rebel Youth. Milligan also co-authored Exploring Big Historical Data with Sean Graham and Scott Bengard, and he wrote The Sage Handbook of Web History with Niels Broger. Milligan is currently co-editor of Internet Histories and was a co-program chair of the ACM IEEE Joint Conference on Digital Libraries. We start with Dr. Barash's presentation, Historical Time, Collective Memory, and Definitions of Historical Understanding. We'll listen to you, Dr. Barash.
Thank you very much. So I took off, you could hear me okay. What I will do, because my article is somewhat long and we have 15 minutes to speak, so I think that I will limit myself to a commentary on one idea, and that is the idea of collective memory and what collective memory has to do with the finitude of historical understanding. I would simply like to elucidate that in a few words. I will put on a PowerPoint image. I think that you can see it now. I hope so. And it's at the center of my talk is this idea of Maurice Halbwachs, the famous French sociologist and thinker who wrote in the 1920s and 30s, and who actually established what I think is the paradigm for talking about collective memory today. And he did so precisely, according to my argument that I will present very briefly, precisely because he emphasized that collective memory and its limits are the principal sign for the finitude of historical understanding. And what I do in my article is I try to illustrate this in terms of one idea that Halbwachs presented in talking about autobiographical memory. And he's speaking about the memory that is recorded by Stendhal in his famous autobiographical text, La Vie de Henri Brulard, The Life of Henri Brulard, which he talks basically about himself. And in this autobiographical novel, Stendhal deals with his grandfather. He deals with his grandfather because Stendhal, as you probably know, was born in Grenoble in the east of France, just before the French Revolution. He was too young during the French Revolution to have been able to remember it. So he had no contact, he had no vivid memories of France and of French life and of the context of the Ancien Régime before the French Revolution. But what is interesting in the novel, as Stendhal presents it, and as Halbwachs records it and takes it as an example in his book, La Mémoire Collective, is that Stendhal illustrates the way in which he had a real, a vivid, a palpable contact with this context of the distant past, the past not so distant, but distant for him to the extent that he could not himself recall it through any personal contact with the Ancien Régime. But he felt that in observing his grandfather, in other words, the gestures of his grandfather, the way his grandfather dressed, the way he put his hat on, the language that he used, which seemed to be a little bit different than the language that people were using after the French Revolution, the period when Stendhal is writing. And two things come out of that. First of them is the idea of an acceleration of historical time. The idea that this momentous event that broke so radically with the past, and after which people actually dressed in a different way. They no longer put on powdered wigs, and they wore pants in a very different fashion, and everything in the country basically changed. The political system, the social structure. There was a great break with the religious past during the French Revolution. Even afterward, during the Restoration, it was clear that things had changed. Stendhal felt that he had a real contact with the past through his grandfather. And even after his grandfather died, what he remembered in later life was the gestures, the language, the argument of Halbach's in dealing with La Vie de Henri Brulard. The argument of Halbach's is precisely that in remembering his grandfather, Stendhal was not simply remembering an isolated person or some personal relation, but also remembering a whole way of being, a way of living that typified in a certain way a lost context, which is the context of the historical past. So in my presentation, what's important is this important demarcation point between that which we can remember directly and through other people, for example, parents like Stendhal's grandfather, on one hand, on the other hand, what is beyond any possibility of recall. In other words, Stendhal could still remember through his grandfather the gestures and the ways of dressing, immediate contact with the past. But there was an immediate contact with the past. But once the living generations, like the generation of his grandfather, died off and no longer were living after 40, 50, 60 years, the younger people completely forgot. Were not able to make any kind of contact with not only with a person or a personal figure, but with the whole context, a whole linguistic structure, a metaphorical structure that can only be retrieved through very careful reconstruction, which is also very partial and piecemeal. So the argument is that through this idea of collective memory and the fact that living generations, once they die, leave behind a context, break off, introduce a discontinuity with the context of the past, which is a kind of a watershed, as you might say, between collective memory of living generations and living people and the historical past, which is beyond any possibility of living recall as such. And so it's in this way that collective memory, in the sense that Halbach establishes it, is the primary sign of the indicator of the finitude of the historical past. So this was really one of the main points I was trying to make in my article. I don't want to belabor it. I think that we have very little time to speak about it. I will simply conclude by saying what the importance of that is for my argument more generally. And that is that I take another slide and show the picture of Hans Jonas. It is that in the same way as we can talk about a finitude of historical understanding that is indicated by collective memory, in the same way, if we think about historical time in terms of the future, and the same finitude that we have become aware of in our own present context, a finitude that in fact is something very novel and something really new in the history of our way of relating to and being in the world, one might say. I think that the corresponding idea of historical finitude that should be emphasized in thinking about the future is precisely that introduced by Hans Jonas in his book, The Principle of Responsibility. And the idea that there is our own historical finitude, the temporal finitude of us as a collectivity, introduces a notion of ethical responsibility, which is extremely important precisely because it's a responsibility that we have to future generations, a responsibility that no other past generation had in the same way, because it is our responsibility, as Jonas argues, to end this devastation of the earth, to end this ecological catastrophe that we had begun to set in motion, and to think in terms of the survival of generations that will come after us, whom we will never know, but toward which we have an ethical duty in the future. So I think that I think my 15 minutes are probably up by now, and I think that to give a very short synopsis and presentation of the basic idea of my article, I think that summarizes it. And I would like to very much thank the organizers, both of the review, Historia Memoria. I think they did a wonderful job in the papers they selected and the organization of the review, in which I was very pleased to be included. And I would also like to very much thank the organizers of this conference. Thank you very much. What do I do now? I think I...
Thank you, Dr. Barash.
Yes.
Move on to the Dr. Kleinberg's presentation. Its title is The Gods of History, a Deconstructive Approximation to the Past. Please go ahead, Dr. Kleinberg.
Thank you. So I want to also thank and congratulate the review because it's not just the special issue, but of course commemorating a decade of really important work. And I want to thank Anaclet and Katerine and Olga. I should also say that Jeffrey and I met up a little while ago to discuss issues of collective memory and history. So there may be a little bit of a rehash of our previous dust up, but you know, it wasn't so much a dust up, it was a discussion. So one thing I do want to say to sort of preface both the article and the discussion today is that the article is drawn from my book, Haunting History, for a Deconstructive Approach to the Past. And it is itself a kind of cry or protest against what I take to be a very anti-theoretical moment in the discipline of history in the United States. And I'd be eager to hear your thoughts on whether you think that's a larger trend or whether that's something that's isolated to what's happening around these parts. I should also say that it gives me great pleasure to talk about haunting history, to talk about, as I do in the article, the legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman. Here, I'll see if I can bring him up. There he is. Because it's Halloween here right now, and the legend of Sleepy Hollow and the story of the Headless Horseman are mainstays of that holiday. But let me begin, to be more serious, by making a distinction between the past, which on my account, the past is everything that's behind us, all that's taken place, whether we remember it or we don't remember it, whether we know it or don't know it, but it's all back there. And between history, which I take to be something different, for our purposes, I'm really talking about disciplinary history and the way disciplinary history is practiced now in the 21st century, although I'd probably deal also with the 20th century. And then finally, memory. Whether individual memory or in the collective variant that Jeffrey works on. And I think these are three distinct categories, at least on my reading, and I want to keep them distinct for the purposes of this discussion. And we can go into that later. And I would also say, in reading over Jeffrey's article, I agree with him. I think he's absolutely right that what we could call the fragmentation of the discipline of history has led to continuity, the sort of continuity that historical narratives once provided are really now found in collective memory. And I think that's germane both to the topic of the journal, but also the rise of memory studies in the last 15 or 20 years. And I'd say this is likely because history and history's grip on this project of continuity was always too tight. And then this led eventually, with a proliferation of different kinds of history, to multiple narratives of continuity, each predicated on a kind of one-to-one ratio with the past, each claiming to their own sort of veracity that then fragmented or bifurcated how continuity could be possible amongst these multiple paths, thus leading to collective memory taking up that mantle in a different sort of way. But the question I ask in my article is whether continuity is what we should be striving for in history, or whether that might take us back to something like an imagined past, back to where we've never been, as I argue in the book. So in the article, I ask historians to instead consider the possibility of a more chaotic, polysemic, and plural understanding of the past, looking not so much to continuities, but to ruptures, to appearances, and hauntings. And I ask they do so by adopting what I call a deconstructive approach to the past. And in the article, I bring up this legend of Sleepy Hollow. Sleepy Hollow is haunted by this ghost, this headless horseman. But as it turns out, the whole region is really haunted by the past that it's suppressed, the past of a violent revolutionary war, the past of the appropriation and probably the decimation of the indigenous peoples, and a host of other events that lay under the surface, unrecollected, unrecalled, untold, but nevertheless haunt the histories of that region. And I would say that this is a far cry, this sort of hauntological approach is a far cry from what I see as the dominant mode of historical discourse today. And this is something I call ontological realism. And what I mean by this, by ontological realism, is a sense that the past can be retrieved and brought into the present if one's methods are sound enough. This is to say that the past maintains ontological properties. It's something that happened in a definitive way, and all we need to do is get our methods just so, and we could bring it back to us. I should also say that I think there are two variants or two modes this works in. There's a very hard one, which is a kind of cartoonish Ronchian version, the past as it really happened. I don't think practicing historians actually believe that variant, and instead, I think they deploy a much weaker form, where they admit that they can't get all the details right, they don't know all the variabilities, there are epistemological slippages. Nevertheless, the past did happen in a certain way, and if we apply the right tools, we can more or less transport it to the present. And I don't think that this is the way the past works, because I don't think the past has ontological properties. This is why I use the term hauntology, because hauntology, which is a Derridian term, actually plays on the way that ontology and ontologie, haunting and ontology, have the same sound in French, maybe not with my accent. But what happens is you have a replacing of the spectral nature of the past, its present absence duality, with a very fleshly, material understanding, so that the hauntology becomes a kind of ontology. But the past, like a ghost, is by definition absent, and thus it has no ontological properties. It perhaps have what we find in the present, or what we force on it, or I would even argue what it sometimes forces on us. And I discuss this in the article by talking about a Charles Dickens story, A Christmas Carol, and the Ghost of Christmas Past, which is a fantastic and wonderful creature because it's this fluctuating, chaotic, effervescent figure that is sometimes one thing, sometimes another. Every time Scrooge seems to think he knows what it is, it changes on him. And I think the past is like a lot like that. And I think historians are a lot like Scrooge because they're always trying to contain or limit or control just exactly what that ghost, what the past is. And I use this to talk about two different sort of valences that we could imagine the past. I talk about past possibles and possible pasts. And the past possibles are open to anything that could have happened, but then they're curtailed by what we imagine to be possible pasts. These are limited by our own epistemological framework or understanding of reality, whether there can be things like ghosts in the 21st century. Our understanding of the past of Sleepy Hollow is one thing if we are people who believe in ghosts and that ghosts are real. And it's something very different if we're people who don't have that epistemological framework in which we exclude a whole host of possibilities. When I talk about ghosts, people seem to think to be able to write it off based on their beliefs. But you could imagine this in terms of multiple logics of the past that we simply don't accept, either because they belong to people who are not adhering to traditional disciplinary history, they're from other cultures, they're from other places, but they excluded from the realm of what is possible and what can be. And rather than curtail the past in this way, I like to think of it, to throw another metaphor at you. This is just one metaphor after another, isn't it? By talking about the past in terms of the poros and an aporia. So if we imagine the past like, say, an ocean, right? And the past, like an ocean, is this open expanse. It's chaotic. There are no demarcations. We're not sure what's there. And what the historian tries to do is create a poros or pathway to the past to try and get us back to what happened, to provide a narrative, to find some markings. And we do this usually by either following the wake of a ship that had come before us, a previous historical telling. Otherwise, we find things in the ocean that have floated up, or maybe a storm comes and brings things up that weren't there before. Now, the problem with this poros, which I'll let you see, this pathway, now if a ship doesn't follow this pathway, it disappears and it's gone. But more often in history, what happens is someone forges a pathway of sorts and other historians tend to follow it. So the example I give in the paper is E.P. Thompson and his famous discussion of the working class in England. And of course, it's not as though the working class didn't exist in England before E.P. Thompson wrote his incredible book, but it was the case that the working class weren't the sorts of subjects about whom histories were written. That was not a possible past to be discussed. And Thompson, by looking actually not at presences, but at absences, by looking at the artifacts and the evidence he did have, was able to find all sorts of opportunities to work out this history of the working class in England. But in doing so, he created a very strong poros, a very strong path. And afterwards, many historians followed it and followed it quite directly. And the problem with such a poros, if one simply stays on that same path, if one maintains it, is it actually becomes an aporia. It becomes a trap or restriction because one then no longer ventures out in to the expanse and the sea beyond the pathway. And I think Joan Scott did a wonderful job of showing how for E.P. Thompson, the possibility of women actors simply did not exist within his history. There were coordinates that were mapped and made, but as a result, other histories were neglected. And I think it's always the case, it simply is the case, that histories are going to be these sorts of partial tellings. These sorts of, I've lost myself on the screen and I see Katerine. Is that happening to others or just to me? Anyone?
No, it's right.
It's okay. I'm visible. Okay. Now I'm disoriented. So with this play between poros and aporia, what seems to happen is that we trap ourselves as historians and neglect the other possibilities that we could be pursuing. And what I want to offer instead is a way to move forward, to not be trapped, say, by the one route of social history, but to allow for that possibility to move forward while at the same time pursuing other possible paths. I use the term the past that is, and I use is with a bar through it, to point to the ways that we don't reclaim the past whole cloth. We actually claim it in this entangled relationship between past and present, between here and gone, between presence and absence. And in maintaining this relation between the poros and the aporia, I want to make sure that historians understand that the way that each telling that they offer is also a restriction. It's not only a presentation of what happened, but it's a limited telling that's only going to focus on a slice, one slice, and perhaps even one logic. And I'd say that in this way, my argument doubles as an ontological questioning of the present. As the past becomes spectral, what kind of present can now be reconceived? The present does not exist as a direct extension of the past, just as historical inquiry cannot treat the past as ontologically given. So in returning to the present, and this entanglement of present and past, inquiry must approach the present and the intervention it seeks to make in the present, first of all, as a kind of détournement or even a hijacking of a past that it can't really account for. Even so, on the stringent or strident or most methodological telling, the past itself, the ghosts of the past, can interrupt or derail such interventions. And so, and here I'll sum up, what I propose, rather than simply moving into a perspectivalism or a relativism, is that we take up a deconstructive approach to the past. And this is an understanding that the past can be approached and taken up via multiple logics and multiple possibilities. And I use the term, the Derridian term, the double geste, in order to explain the strategy. And the way this works, and I could give the example of a book on Emmanuel Levinas that I've just finished, for instance, is to allow multiple ways of understanding the past to exist at the same time, such that they contest with each other. In the case of the Levinas book, I present an intellectual history that runs on very traditional secular coordinates, but I also take up Levinas's lectures about Talmud and sacred Jewish texts on his own terms as a transcendent conduit to the divine. And this forces the reader and the historian to question the assumptions by which we decide which epistemological or methodological regime is the dominant one. And of course, on my movement, neither is dominant because aspects of each are always already in the other. So this is a contestation and a conversation about what the past is that allows for these sorts of chaotic and polysemic possibilities. It does not foreclose other possibilities from the past, even though it seeks to chart out a particular trajectory of its own. In this way, I'd say that it's an attempt to approach the past that can be chaotic and can be disconcerting, but can also be welcoming, and certainly is welcoming to the ghosts that haunt history. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kleinberg. And the following presentation is titled History in the Era of Abundance, Web Archives and Historical Research by Dr. Ian Milligan. We listen to you, Dr. Milligan.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the Journal for hosting this wonderful special issue, for the translation, to the organizers of this event, and to my fellow panelists. I already have a bunch of notes and readings to do, which is, I think, the hallmark of anything, what you want to get out of a panel. So, hi everybody, my name's Ian Milligan from the University of Waterloo, and I'm going to give a quick overview of my submission to the Journal, which was sort of a condensed version of a book I recently published called History in the Age of Abundance. I do want to apologize that I don't speak Spanish. If anybody does have any questions, my email address will be on the last slide. Happy to email back and forth using Google Translate. And I'm always conscious, it's really hard to get a haircut here in Ontario, so I know I increasingly look very disheveled, which is fun. So let me begin. I want to begin by talking a little bit about the problem, or why I think web archives matter. And I'll explain what web archives are very shortly. Now, the problem that I'm trying to tackle in my piece and in my broader book is that I believe our collective cultural heritage is facing a serious problem in the digital age. We used to forget. Now, thanks to all of this digital information preserved at places like the Internet Archive, pictured here, we have the power of recall and retrieval at a scale that is decisively changing how our society remembers. For professionals like historians who interpret and bring shape to narratives of the past, this is a dramatic shift. Having all of this data, to me, brings with it great power. The prospect of a more democratic history, of more voices included in the historical record, the social historian's dream. Yet it also brings significant challenges. What does it mean to write histories with born digital sources, from websites written in the 1990s to tweets posted today? How can historians be ready, both from a technical perspective as well as from a social and an ethical one, to use the web as a historical source, to use the web as an archive? To put the problem in slightly more concrete terms, I often like to turn to something as innocuous as a personal homepage hosted on the geocities.com service. And this is the sort of running case study I use in my Historia Why Memoria article. Geocities.com, founded in 1994, provided a free website to anybody who wanted one. You'd open up your web browser, you'd go to geocities.com, you'd enter your email address, and you'd receive a free megabyte to stake your own space on the burgeoning information superhighway. And they could be sites about anything you're interested in: a favorite television show, your family tree, young children talking about their love of, stuffed animals or Lego or etc., or even early versions of blogs talking about people's lives and what they're seeing around them, their towns, etc. Now, why I find GeoCities so interesting is that we can see how quickly it grew and how many sources from just that one website are left to us today. The first 10,000 users created websites on geocities.com by October of 1995, 100,000 by August of 1996, and 1 million by October of 1997. Today, we have that archive. We worked with the Internet Archive. We have all of GeoCities in our research unit, and it's something like 186 million documents, like HTML pages, created by somewhere around 7 million unique users. And that's just one website alone. Over a relatively short period of time has produced this amount of data that would take multiple lifetimes to read. And if we start to scale that, we see that GeoCities is just a fraction, of course. The Internet Archive, which is the nonprofit in San Francisco, founded in 1996, has hundreds of billions of pages and nearly 100 petabytes of unique data. In France, Britain, Portugal, Denmark, etc., all websites published in their countries are archived in perpetuity. If I write my website, if I'm a Dane or I'm in France or England, I write a website talking about something going on in my life. That actually ends up, thanks to their legal deposit powers, in the British Library or the BNF for perpetuity. And so all of this, to me, can be combined as, really seeing that our historical record, as the American historian Roy Rosenweg posited almost 2 decades ago, is one that's really that of abundance, not scarcity. Or as I put it, If you're working with traditional archives, you're usually wishing you had more information. If you're working with something like GeoCities, you wish you had less information. You have to grapple. Now, I try to also posit in the article that this is not a niche concern for any topic from the mid-1990s and beyond. That I think any scholar studying things like business historians, government departments, studying something like Occupy Wall Street or Idle No More or the COVID-19 pandemic, studying nonprofits, charities, universities, etc., you can't really imagine doing justice to any topic in any domain really after the advent of the web, especially by the late 90s when it's very widespread, where you don't have to use these kinds of sources. So I think all historians need to have this on their radar, that fundamentally the nature of a historical record will be transformed. In other words, all historians are going to need to use web-based sources. This isn't just historians of the internet. This isn't just social historians interested in activists or medical historians interested in COVID. This is anybody trying to study anything after the late 90s is going to have to grapple with what it means to use web archives. None of this means that it's a perfect record. Constantly you get backlash on web archives saying, well, it doesn't have X or Y. It's not a complete record of X or Y. We know as historians, nothing's a complete record. We all need to use all our sources with cautionary notes. We can see here the web is, of course, not geographically evenly distributed, both now and certainly over the last 20 years. I have an entire lecture on the global evolution of the internet, if we want to talk about that. And even today, we know that usage skews young adults, college graduates, those from high-income households. But so do print archives in various ways. So my major points coming up to this in the sort of first third of my talk is the 1990s are now history. When something becomes history, when we begin to write about it without people rolling their eyes, somewhere around 25 to 30 years, we're starting to see people see this as a legitimate topic of inquiry. The web seems new. We still call it new media, but the web is almost 30 years old. And for about 25 of those years, since 1996, we actually have pretty comprehensive and growing records of what that looked like. So the 90s are coming. The web is almost 30 years old, and web archives have been here for a while. In other words, if we wanted to have two pithy sort of bullet points to anchor that first part of my talk and the first part of my article, I don't think you can do justice to these topics without the web. And then crucially, as a bridge to my next part of my talk, I don't think historians are ready. That we have a real crisis on the horizon of what this means. So if you want to use web archives today, you can. You can do it while I'm talking. You can pull up a web browser later today, and you can visit the Internet Archive at archive.org/web, and you can type in the URL of what you're looking for or do a keyword search on page titles or home pages. So they don't have full text search across the whole collection, but you can do full text search to find, say, the university website on that very first page. You just can't search within it. And I'll show you what that looks like in case you're not familiar with the Wayback Machine. So here I am. I'll search up our host institution, UPTC. We can go back. We can see that they started collecting their website in December of 1998. We can see what that page mostly looked like on December 12th, 1998. Looks beautiful. I'm in Waterloo, everything looks beautiful. Here we are, faculties, and we can actually go to there are not many web pages, but we can see here an education web page here and get a sense of what that looks like. So this is primarily how people use web archives. And I think this is both really great, but it also poses challenges as a historian, because right now we have all of this historical material that we're going to need to use. And the main query is, if you know exactly what you're looking for, if you know you have a given university or you want to look at the New York Times homepage on a given day, you can do that. You can replay the page as it, to some degree, once was. But the cons are it can be slow. I'd run that search before I recorded it, so it's a little bit faster because they cache your queries. But most importantly, it requires page-by-page browsing. I would rather print off the web page and probably skim it in an archive than have to manually click on links and go back and forward, etc. And with the digital humanities, we can begin to ask, what if you wanted to analyze all the pages on the UTPC webpage? If you wanted to see how it changes over time, how links work, what images are used in different faculties, these sort of big questions that we're getting with computational research that we can't necessarily do today. And so an argument in my book and in a lot of my related work is that historians aren't going to necessarily work with the Wayback Machine. That doesn't scale to the kind of research flows that we do. That instead we might need to work with things like the underlying data. So web archives have a standard. It's a ISO standard everywhere around the world. People have decided, let's make web archives look the same so we can design interoperable tools to work with them. And these are files called WARC, or Web Archive files. Now the problem is, we say the Wayback Machine isn't enough, so you have to work with the underlying data. Working with the underlying data is really, really tough, because suddenly if I was to give a historian 50 gigabytes or 3 terabytes of data, they would probably tell me to go away. Because those current solutions either include coding, and I think most historians are not able to program, or programs, our discipline doesn't incentivize computational work, and it probably shouldn't incentivize computational work, because that's getting pretty far afield from really what historians are trained to do and what historians want to do. So Wayback Machine is not enough, but the other solutions as currently exist actually require us to become like big data practitioners, and that's not going to work either. So we have this 2 problem. Professional training doesn't have methodological reflection. Just in general, historians, we don't write about our methods enough. We bury our methods in footnotes. Peer reviewers tell us to take them out. We don't have that strong vein of discussion, this conversation aside. And then the tools and platforms require too much specialized knowledge. So why aren't we ready in some? Current tools require what you're knowing for. More detailed things require access to the data. That requires skills we don't have. And so this is the middle third of my talk, where it's sort of, we can do these great things with web archives, but we're not ready. And there's no immediate way to realize, how we are going to be ready to do this. So in the last third of my talk, though, I want to try to make a case going back to geocities.com by talking a little bit about what we might be able to do if we do computational research. And in further discussion, talking about some of the tools that we're developing to make this possible. So a lot of my side job is I lead an infrastructure project, which has been funded by the Mellon Foundation. And we're trying to let historians do this sort of stuff just from web browsers, data crunching in the background, to sort of lower the barriers to access. So let me show you some of the things you might be able to do if we go down the computational route very quickly with geocities.com. So my brief recap, I know it was 10 minutes ago, but of course, geocities.com, founded in 1994. It ends in 2009. It's shut down by Yahoo. So you can only access those 186 million pages, so 7 million user accounts through web archives. So it's a dead website. If you go to geocities.com today, you'll get an advertisement for like a web hosting industry. You really don't get a sense that for a period, it was the 3rd most popular website on the internet, on the web, and was a significant hub of activity. So what research questions have I asked about GeoCities? And in the paper, which I wrote for this journal article, my question was sort of harkening back to a classic debate in early internet history and sociology and social sciences and early historical inquiries, which is the question of virtual communities. As people moved online, were the communities that they formed online, were they substitutes for real communities? Were they communities? How did people engage? And that sort of thing. So my primary research question in the paper is, can we find community across 186 million pages? Now, GeoCities is neat because users were clustered based on interest. You'd find a neighborhood. So GeoCities, it has a geo, like a spatial element just to the name itself. And it actually was sort of mirrored that way, where you would have a map and you would find a neighborhood, and in that neighborhood, you would build your website. So if you were interested in philosophical topics, like you wanted to build a website about historiography, you would build your website in the Athens neighborhood. If you were a kid, you would, under the age of 12, you'd be funneled to the Enchanted Forest, where you'd talk about your lives, your toys, etc. If you're a car enthusiast, Motor City. And if you were interested in connecting with LGBTQ plus community members, you'd gather in West Hollywood, which was a sort of interesting, another interesting community that was a little bit different. Now, the question was, if we were a historian and we wanted to imagine how could we find community, this is where that scale problem comes in, because GeoCities is so large that with 186 million pages, 7 million user accounts, I can't read them all. That would take more lifetimes than I'm going to have. And I wouldn't be able to search them using the Wayback Machine. I'm not going to click through all those pages as well. So we decided to develop platforms to take GeoCities and take all of the text out, take all of the images out, and work with our friends in other disciplines to analyze it computationally as a way to sort of imagine what this wave of research might look like. So we took 3 various approaches. We topic modeled, we looked at various neighborhoods, and we wanted to say, his computer scientists and information retrieval experts have ways to take a bunch of data and tell you what topics were in it. We said, let's start feeding it the neighborhoods, and you tell us what the topics are, and we'll see if that lines up with what they should have been about. And we found that was true. The car place actually was talking about cars. Athens really was talking about lofty philosophical ideas. The computer scientists found what we should have found. We did image analysis. Let's take all the images from the neighborhoods. Let's see how they shared, sort of like early memes. How do images get transmitted around the neighborhood? And then cognition of time, I'll just focus on the last one. We also looked at hyperlink analysis. People on the early web, the World Wide Web, it's a web of links. They would link to each other. And if links are deliberate, we thought we could find community in seeing who did people choose to link to and why. So we did stuff like this. We see there's the origin. Here's an example table. There's a website at the left. There's where it was linking to at right. We started counting the links to see what websites were the most linked to within these networks. And then when we go to those websites that everybody was linking to, read them and find out what was going on. So here's one neighborhood. There's the Enchanted Forest, the kids' websites. These are all of the websites, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of websites, tens of thousands of users, how they all link to each other, the kind of conversations they had. And then we can actually go in and begin to find, what was the highest ranked page? What was the page that everybody linked to? And we saw in this case, it was awards. And then you go into awards and we found community centers, we found newsletters, and we found this sort of vibrant evidence of all these conversations and sharing that was going on in this community that's been largely forgotten by historians. So we used all these tools as sort of a mixed method of, we can't read all the pages, but we're historians, we'll have to read some. We need to find the pages of interest. And so this approach to us struck us as a viable pathway. So as I talk about in the paper, the combination of methods shows us that this is a viable method. It substantively showed in a sort of contributions that came out of it that the neighborhood system worked, that led to substantial community behavior. And as I argued, community was deliberately and physically enacted on the network. As I come towards the end of my time here, it also raised other issues, and I talk about these at length in the paper and also in some other publications that have come out recently, which are the problems of ethics. We're dealing with these websites that were created between primarily 94 and 2001. People search wasn't a thing. So they included their full names, they include personal information. There were some FTC suits out of this actually. Contact information. They give no consent. People can feel violated. People feel weird that what they wrote 20 years ago is suddenly accessible to a historian doing research in this field. And it adds all these questions around how we can actually use this material fairly indiscriminately by memory institutions. So I very briefly noted, again, this is like 40-minute paper territory, but we talk about we're used to as historians putting a lot of these questions on archives. Instead, we need to take that on ourselves, think about reasonable expectations of privacy. That's where some of these link research can help, and all the research being done. So the two main themes of what I've been trying to get across in my short time here today: historical research is being transformed by digital sources. Are we ready? And historians are going to need new standards. We're going to need new practices. We're going to need to some degree, build our understandings of computers and algorithms. We're going to need to work collaboratively to be ready to deal with this flood of sources that's coming our way. I do think a more inclusive history is around the corner. I'm a social historian at heart, despite E.P. Thompson's, that's a great example. We, of course, need to be ready. And with that, I'll thank you. I'll thank the organizers again. And if there are any follow-up questions or linguistic issues, please just send me an email at i2millig@uwaterloo.ca. So thanks, everybody, and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Milligan. We continue begin with the question for all of you. I try to link your papers with current topics. If you agree, please answer in the same order as your presentation. Sorry. The first one is a suggestion from Roberto Breñas, a professor at El Colegio de Mexico. He wrote a text on nexus.com.mx and shared with me before. During the last months, we have seen an increase in the anti-status movement, especially status of conquerors and slavers. Some leaders, even the President of Mexico, have demanded that Spain and the Pope apologize for the conquest of the Americas. Also, the current problems of native people are explained only by centuries of colonial rule, while democratic governments of the last 200 years, in the Americas in general, are not held responsible for that. What do you think about this kind of memory usage? And what do you think about using present values to judge past actions? Dr. Barash, if you want.
Okay, I'll put the sound back on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me now?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay. Could you repeat the question again?
Okay. During the last months, we have seen an increase in the anti-status movement, especially status of conquerors and slavers. Some leaders, even the President of Mexico, have demanded Spain and the Pope apologize for the conquest of the Americas. Also, the current problems of native people are explained only by centuries of colonial rule, while democratic governments of the last 200 years are not held responsible for that. What do you think about this kind of memory usage? And what do you think about using present values to judge past actions?
That's a very good question. It's a difficult question. I agree very much with Ethan Kleinberg, what he was talking about in talking about a past that haunts us. And I think the metaphor of haunting is very appropriate. In other words, I think that it's not simply because we have forgotten the past, and it's not simply because we don't know about the past or we deny the past, that it has no relevance to us, no meaning for us. I think that it really is the past, and if you're talking about the colonial past, and the fact that there were certain attitudes, certain mentalities, certain practices of domination that were current and that lasted for many centuries. I think that there's no denying the fact that they molded our own ways of being today, our own social interrelations and our most intimate and often tacit attitudes. And I think that the work of historians, especially if we're talking about the relation between collective memory and the historical past, has to do precisely with the uncovering and the understanding of the deep level of symbolic interrelations that we have inherited from the past, that in many ways are still very much active in our modes of interaction with one another, in marking our ways of being together in a common world, often in ways that we're not even aware of, or that we have to be reminded of. I think that Ethan's example of the relation, for example, between different genders over time, and the fact that in many cases, the question of women was simply not taken into consideration for many past generations. This doesn't mean that this past and the history of relations between men and women over long periods of history do not have a direct relation to the ways in which we relate today. And I think that also the symbolic modes of interaction that are important to us. And I think that this is something, in other words, the tacit and the unexpressed, oftentimes unacknowledged levels of historical interaction. These are things that the reason why we study history and why we take history to be important is precisely in order to uncover and to place in relief, to emphasize those aspects of the past that oftentimes have been erased, or that we think have been erased, but that in fact return, as Ethan says, to haunt us. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Dr. Klimber, please.
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in and build on that, because I think it's a really very important question, and I appreciate it. And I guess I would start by saying that I think oftentimes the defenders of statues do so by means of a category mistake, because so often they equate the statue itself with the history it's meant to represent. And we can ask about memory usage and the way that perhaps we're taking up presentist concerns to address past issues. But the statues themselves almost always are constructed after the fact, and they themselves were constructed to address present concerns by means of privileging one past over another. The statues are not neutral sites. They're political sites, they're ideological sites, sometimes they're ethical sites, but they're an attempt to suppress and often extinguish certain pasts by means of promoting others. So when we're asked to reconsider the nature or presence of a statue, really, again, we're moving into the realm of the dominance of presence, of what's there. And if the conversation is all about what's there, I think you're taking your eye off the most important issue, which is those histories, those people, those voices who are not represented by a statue or an image or a history. And so it is, to my mind, less an issue of a tearing down, although that certainly is a moment and perhaps an important moment. In my world, it would be actually a preservation, but it would be a contestation saying this statue isn't a neutral site representing history as it happened. It's actually a political site. It's an ideological site. And it's a site that we need to contest precisely because of all those histories it stands over. If it's a gravestone, it's a gravestone that not only symbolizes the figure that's standing there, but also all of the other figures who are not allowed to stand up anymore. So I think it's an important question and one we need to grapple with, but one that allows us to imagine our present concerns and the way that there are new possibilities of what we imagine as the past and how important those might be and what they can do for us, especially politically.
Thank you. Dr. Milligan, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I think so much has been well said in the previous two responses that I just found myself nodding along with it. I mean, I think on one level there is that cautionary note that, of course, historians need to understand historical context. And I don't think most of us would have broad agreement with that. But when it comes to statues, or in Canada, we're having quite a bit of controversy over names of buildings and things like that. And there's often a call to historians to intervene on the side of preserving. You know, we need to keep that name, even if it was named in 1960 about somebody from 1860, we need to keep that name on the building for historical reasons. And I think echoing, what Ethan just said, statues exist in the present, names exist in the present, and they're as much about who we are today and what our society values as they are. They're not really about knowing history at all. So I'm in favor, when we talk about renaming things here in Canada and rethinking our statues, I'm always in favor of, we're not prisoners to history. We need to reassess what that is today. And same with apologies and official apologies. Something that we know today was wrong, and that our society is coming to a broad consensus that we need to move past some of the crimes and terrible things that have been done in the past. Historians should be part of that conversation and are part of that conversation, not to stand aside, but to talk about, what we can learn about that and how we can recognize, past wrongs without falling on our swords about statues and names and that sort of thing. So thanks for the question.
Okay, thank you. Yes. And also, Roberto Breña, he said, if I understood well, historians are not prepared to deal with digital archives, mainly due to the amount of information. This will be an ever-increasing problem. What will be the conclusion then? I suppose the question is for Dr. Milligan.
Yeah, so just so to clarify the question, could you just repeat the question? It's about...
Yes. He said, if I understood well, historians are not prepared to deal with digital archives, mainly due to the amount of information. This will be an ever-increasing problem. What will be the conclusion then?
Okay. Well, yeah, to me, it's a mixture. That's a great question. And just, something I could speak for too long, so I'll try not to. I think it's a mixture of two things. I think on the one hand, and this I didn't delve into detail in my presentation today, is developing better tools and infrastructure. Lots of what we do with our computers today is pretty magical. I mean, we go to archives, we take digital photographs if we're permitted, we go to repositories, we access sources from around the world in the blink of an eye. I could be working with 19th century French documents like right now if I wanted to. And we don't think about that much. Like we don't think about JSTOR, these other repositories that consciously, because they kind of just work. They become sort of the plumbing of research that historians do. So part of it is lowering the barrier, and we're working with the Internet Archive in Mellon and a few other partners to basically develop a research infrastructure at the Internet Archive that makes it easier for scholars to do stuff. They could say, I really want all the text and I want to find out the most common names, etc. I can do that with a few clicks in a web browser, or I can go to my local library and get some help with that. So part of it is developing tools like JSTOR, like all these other repositories, like the British Library's website, etc., that lower the barriers. But in some ways, this is more challenging because we're not, unlike normal archives or traditional archives, we just can't rely on archives and libraries to bring shape to these sources. Like we're not going to get that finding aids system. We're not going to get that detailed metadata we're used to dealing with. And so tools and platforms need to come towards historians. And then I think there is some element of we need to think about what historians need to learn and how our profession needs to change, both to build up methodological capacity more generally, to make that more of a staple of our training, and in some cases to think about what technical fluency historians might need. That's not like we're all going to become programmers like the dark ages of the 70s, which kind of soured a lot of people in quantitative historians. But it's thinking about algorithms rule our lives. We use Google to find historical things. We sit at our computers 9 hours, 10 hours a day doing our jobs, but we still don't think consciously about how technology mediates our work. And so tools need to get better and historians need to maybe move towards it. And there's some sort of good faith engagement from both sides could lead to a good pathway forward.
Okay, and Dr. Klimber or Dr.
Dr. Barash.
Yes. I can't hear you. Let me see here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, now I can hear you.
The question, Dr. Barash?
Yes.
I think they're seeing if you have any questions on digital archives. You may or may not.
Oh, if I have questions, I do have a question for Ian Mulligan. I very much enjoyed your talk. My question is about algorithms precisely, because I'm very interested in my most recent work. I work a lot on the question of images and visual dimension of experience, and what I call an image culture. And I was dealing precisely with this in relation to the web. And the question I come up against again and again is the question of how exactly algorithms function. And it seems to me to be something extremely complex when you begin getting into it. In other words, when you call something up on Google, the fact that you get something first and not second. In Facebook, the people who are suggested to you as possible friends and things like that, all of these operate, of course, on algorithms. But of course, at the same time, this process, which is so important in our daily lives, I mean, it's something that orients us, exactly what you said. It orients us in ways that we're not even aware of. And they're so complex that sometimes we don't, we're not really aware of where this is coming from. What do you look at? I mean, what is the best way to discover something more about this? How do you, as somebody who's really a specialist in this field, how do you deal with the question? How do you handle the question of algorithms and the way in which they orient our research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, part of it is, on the one hand, when we develop tools, I think it's important for historians and others to be at the table. And I do a lot of work in this field, collaborating with others, just so that I can have a way that I can explain the algorithm to other historians, for example. Or so it's not a black box. It's not the Google example is a great one. It's not like you're looking for something in a repository I've developed and you type in a keyword search and you get 7 million results. And you don't know why your answers are on page 1 and 2, because that's the problem, right? Like, no one's going to read all 7 million, as you say. People just read the first 2 pages, so they need to understand. So part of that is having people like myself and others involved in teams developing these things. It's also having the fluency, and I think that's where intermediaries come in, like myself, or a library information scholar, Sophia Noble, who wrote a book, Algorithms of Oppression, who study Google, who study these things and think about how they're constructed and the underlying biases and the underlying assumptions that go into them. Some of that's reading the technical literature, some of that's interviewing, former Google employees. And I'm always amazed. I try to teach this to my undergrads whenever I can teach a methods course, and just thinking about how the role algorithms play and how hard it is without subject-specific knowledge to disentangle that.
Yeah.
So and reading computer science papers, they can be tough, but some of them are well written. And when they're not well written, usually there's a subgenre of people who are good at interpreting that for us lay people. But it's yeah. But once you're conscious of algorithmic bias, it really does change the way you begin to look at the world, and that's something I think it's really worth underscoring.
Well, it's very important because it's becoming more and more important, especially since remember that Donald Trump criticized Google precisely for this reason, saying that the algorithms were cheating in a certain way in order to de-emphasize him. And so it became a big political issue. As soon as the question was whether certain political parties or political orientation are being excluded through the algorithms. And of course, this is going to become a question that will be more and more important over the next few years, it seems to me. In fact, I think that when Google and Facebook were called up before Congress recently, this is one of the questions they were asked, if I understand correctly, how their system of algorithms prevents the introduction of massive political bias. I think it's a very important question.
Can I turn this around and make it a little backward face?
Yes.
Because Ian, I actually agree with what you're saying wholeheartedly, especially in terms of training and the needs for historians to be doing something quite different. Obviously the historical discipline changed very much in the 19th century with the establishment of the National Archives and the credibility it gave to certain kind of documents. one could imagine the historical profession should need to change again to be able to be the sorts of people who can address the kind of documents that are out there, just as we've had these changes before. But I am a little surprised in your suspicion of current historians and confidence in past ones, because it's not my assumption that historians working in archives, at least until the last maybe 20 years, spent any time thinking about why the information that was stored there was granted the authority it was, or thinking about why the material they were getting should be the basis of a history as opposed to other materials, oral histories, myths, paintings. And so it strikes me this has been a problem for historians. It's not a current problem. It seems to be also a past problem, that historians are quite willing to take things on authoritative assumptions if they think it's just will get them where they want to go in telling their stories. So I'm interested in your thoughts in that relation between past practices and present practices, and whether you think the historians can make the kind of leap for which you're calling this suspicion.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, part of it is probably me being diplomatic, is because I think when we move to these new sources, we're conscious about them, right? Like, we're not used to dealing with them. So we think long and hard. We think about all the reasons why Twitter's a bad source. We think about all the reasons why web archives are bad sources. And you're right, whereas we don't think about all the reasons that Library and Archives Canada or the National Archives of the United States contain certain kinds of knowledge. And yeah, so you're right, there's so you're sort of arguing that there's an uncritical current that's run through historical thinking, and I think we wrote a white paper with the Center for New Media, convened a white paper, and it was funny. We were mostly talking about the challenges of doing methodological history in a field that doesn't really want to foster those conversations necessarily. Like, if you submit a manuscript talking about a long extensive note on a record group and the bias that went into the record group, outside of some fields, probably an editor will ask you to cut it, or you'll be disciplined to cut it yourself.
Yeah,
I think that's a great, and I'll probably emphasize that more in the future, that some of the lessons we learn because we're conscious about these new sources, we should be reading backwards and be conscious of all our sources.
Yeah, I make this argument in Haunting History. I have a chapter called The Analog Ceiling, where I try to make the argument that the biggest impediment to these sorts of digital innovations is adhering to these past analog practices that get smuggled in to these current attempts to expand the field of knowledge and expand what history is or could be. So
that's awesome. That's great.
But yeah, I think what you're doing is exactly what historians need to hear, and so that they can look back with suspicion in the way you're trying to raise the questions about the sources they're using now. That unfamiliarity may be the key, as you suggest. So.
Thank you. And I was offline just a moment. We have another question from Ricardo Flores. He said, I think a lot of issues here are tied with the notion of reading. I will ask Professor Klingberg if he finds a deconstructive approach to the past tied to a dialogical or deconstructive reading.
So that's also a good question, and certainly I think you've seen it in all of our discussions. There's been I think maybe overemphasis on the use of text. Now that's what historians have used. I'd say that what I try to do in the article in the book is actually expand what this idea of reading could mean, so that it isn't tied to written text, but in fact it is more of an interpretive strategy about the way meanings move over time. Ultimately, what I would hope is a deconstructive approach would allow one to place, say, written records in conversation and contestation with oral records, with pictorial histories, with different understandings. If you think of Australian Aboriginal paintings, which are their means of history and have a different understanding of time, if one takes that temporal and narrative logic seriously, as I think you should, then that forces one to think why we use a certain privileging of reading and writing over a different means of telling history. And if you can become a sensitive reader of multiple sources, then that expands what the past could be, and also again forces us to be more suspicious of what we've taken to be the privileged sources by which we access the past.
Thank you. And the last question is for all of you. Is you sent your papers when this pandemic just started. 8 or 7 months after, what do you think might be the challenges that historians will face in a post-pandemic world? Dr. Barash?
Okay. I wonder about what that means, a post-pandemic world, because I think that in a world like it is today, with increased contacts to such a great extent, I wonder whether we're not looking at a world in which we'll be able perhaps to master pandemics better. But I think this is in the future. Unfortunately, I don't believe that there will be a post-pandemic world. There'll be periods in which pandemics will be less frequent. But when you look at the last 20 years, when you look at, there are a lot of different pandemics that could have erupted and become very serious. I think of Ebola, for example, which nonetheless was restrained. But the question is, what's going to happen over the next, this is why I think that Jonas, who I introduced a bit earlier, the question of a responsibility toward future generations. I think the question of also the pandemic and the post-pandemic, as you mentioned it, introduces the question also in relation to ecology, in relation to the practices that we do, what we are doing today, that may have an influence on the future in a very dangerous fashion. But on the contrary, the ways in which today, in which we might better prepare for the uncertainties and the contingencies of the future, might make future pandemics, if not avoidable, more manageable. And I think that the present situation in the world, where there is so little consultation, where the World Health Organization is being criticized and contested, and where we have no concerted international global schema of operation and of coordination, I think this is the first thing that we have to address, also as historians, but as social scientists and social thinkers more generally.
So I can jump in, and it's a difficult and really wonderful question. And as Jeffrey knows, I probably court danger more than run from it. I think one thing for historians that a post-pandemic world lays bare is the illusion of control that historians want to maintain. I would argue that historians are so enamored of having continuous, realistic, and orderly narratives about the past because they're trying to assert a control over the past that they can't assert over the present. And this realization that we're in a precarious world where things happen beyond our control might actually be an opening to rethink about the ways that we deal with the past, that it doesn't have to be about mastery in the same way. In some ways, it's about negotiation. It's about communication, as Jeffrey suggests, but it's also about understanding the possibility of what Zoltan Simon calls unprecedented change. And I think this, again, are these sort of possibilities that are unimaginable possibilities. For better and for worse. I mean, that's sort of the Nietzschean side of this danger, is that you don't know how these things are going to turn out, and they're not necessarily going to turn out for the better, but the possibilities are there. And I think that historians need to be less about tamping down these possibilities when confronting these sorts of events, and more about opening them up opening up the possibilities and finding new ways to go, new ways to do things. It's not going to be the same, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
And Dr. Milligan?
Yeah, thank you. This is a fascinating discussion. So I come at it from a slightly different angle, probably just because of some pragmatic work I've been doing on a task force that's looking in Canada what the sort of next stages will be for our memory institutions. And so it's funny that when you mentioned what this will look like in the post-pandemic world, there's the standard concerns around funding and government investment, which we can stay away from today because they're not as much fun. But then I think it's worthwhile thinking about how, and here I'm thinking of the Canadian context, our memory of the Spanish flu was more or less, it was sort of a footnote in our historiography and a footnote in our cultural memory, at least in Canada. And we're increasingly wondering how we can best document what's going on in Canada as historians working with librarians and archivists, so that in the future, we'll have a memory of this sort of fairly singular moment we've been living through, especially the early lockdowns. And also, because in Canada, our government has been just sending out new programs every day for a while. You know, we flirted with a basic income. We have new health programs. We have COVID tracking apps. Like I get surveilled every day of my life in ways that would have been unpredictable before. And I think, you know, in 10 years or even 5 years, policymakers and others are going to have to sit down and start thinking about, you know, how can we measure, you know, what new things did COVID bring to our society that were already on the horizon and just accelerated them? What fundamental changes have happened? Have they been effective? If we think about, you know, income support programs, as we've sort of forced everybody out of work, how do we measure the efficacy of income support programs? And that's not just economists, that's going to be historians, and historians making sure we have the right kind of data and sources to analyze that, and historians to make sure that what ends up in our, you know, long-term memory in archives and libraries captures this sort of opinion. Because the side note on the digital front is we're confronted, we're doing lots of digital archiving, but, you know, already I think a lot of us have trouble telling what's a Russian disinformation bot. You know, one of our fun problems in Canada. What's a disinformation bot? What's a real person? What's a genuine political movement opposed to X or Y? What is 10 people that are inflating their importance? All of these things are challenging, of course, for norm in an analog record, and they're really, really challenging on these platforms where people are dedicating their lives to spreading disinformation. And so we're just being conscious there's no magic bullet, but it's the kind of thing that, you know, we can't give control of these programs and we imagine just to social scientists, just to political scientists, just to economists, just to librarians, just to archivists. And it really, to me, suggests that collaborative element of us all working together to imagine what post-COVID society is going to look like.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this online session, and thank you for being here in an online way. You are welcome to my country and my university whenever you want. And to our audience, thanks for your company. Please read the review and the special issue, and see you in our upcoming events. Olga, ¿quieres decir algo?
Primero, pues, un agradecimiento a los expositores, History and Memory Phrases Tank, to the doctors, Kleinderberg, Barash, Milligan, by participation in the exposition, by thanks for the Catherine Mora for coordination of events. Nuestros agradecimientos a los expositores por la participación, a nuestra coordinadora del panel por este ejercicio sistemático, a todos ustedes por la asistencia y participación, y los invitamos a otro conversatorio de historia y memoria, que pues queremos incursionar a través de este mecanismo para dialogar con los autores y poder conocer de cerca sus expresiones y reflexiones, así como hemos tenido hoy con la participación de los doctores Barash, Kleinberg y Milligan, quienes han ilustrado desde su lengua nativa, el inglés, sus propuestas investigativas, que desde luego están traducidas en la revista Historia y Memoria, y que es una manera de profundizar sobre sus reflexiones teóricas, porque es justamente esto es lo que han hecho en Historia y Memoria, unas reflexiones teóricas sobre el tiempo en la historia, el tiempo y la memoria en la historia, sobre la deconstrucción como herramienta de interpretación histórica y sobre las nuevas dinámicas de la historia en redes sociales o la historia digital. A ustedes muchas gracias por la invitación, muchas gracias por la participación y a ustedes por haber aceptado nuestra invitación, doctor Barash, doctor Kleinberg y doctor Milligan. Doctora Catherine, muchas gracias. Doctora Silvina, gracias.
Thank you.